So going along with the process of ratio analysis, let's look at some ratios. Before we're doing that, let's just remember that ratios in the end, remember, it's just one number divided by another number, right? So it is important, of course, to select relevant ratios, but it's also very important to compare them to either similar ratios of other competitors, other companies in the same industry, and or compare them to your own historical evolution. Because suppose that you are looking at, let's say, a ratio called return on equity, right? Which is basically your net income divided by your equity. Let's suppose that for now that your net income is 20, your equity is 100. What does that mean? It means that the profitability that you're earning on those 100 that the shareholders have provided is 20%, right? Is the 20% profitability high or low? One could assume that it may be satisfactory, but what if your competitors are earning 40% or 50% on average? Then it doesn't look as good. Or what if your own historical evolution has been such that the previous year you earned 30%, 2 years before that you earned 40%, and so what's occurring is that though 20% may seem reasonable, what's been happening is that in the last 2 years your profitability has been falling. So as you can see, the number per se on its own is not much information. It's much more rich if you were able to compare that to other companies in the same industry and or your own historical evolution. Okay, let's look at some ratios. Leverage is just a measure of how much debt you have in your company. We call it capital structure because capital structure is just the mix of debt and equity that you're using in order to fund yourself. So a leverage ratio is just a measure of that, how much debt you have in your firm. And the down arrow indicates that in general, we don't want to see very high debt because that means that there's more risk of you not being able to pay. That's why the down arrow has that direction. That has to be taken with a grain of salt because there's other reasons why you may want to have debt. But we'll go into that later on in the course. Right for now, a ratio that measures your leverage is just measuring how much debt you have in the company. So debt to capital is one of those ratios and is typically expressed in percentage terms. So suppose that you have a total debt of 10, right? 10, 10,000, 10 million, whatever that may be, right? And your equity is also 10. So what does that mean? That this debt to capital ratio will tell you that you have a debt equal to 10. So there's 10 in the denominator as well. And if your equity is also 10, your debt to capital ratio is 10 over 20, 50%. Okay. What that basically means is that 50% of the funds that you've raised, which are the 20, came from debt. Okay. This ratio, I think, is much more intuitive than the second ratio that I'm about to discuss, even though the second ratio is also used very frequently. Why is this more intuitive? Because it's easy to see that 50% means that half of your money is coming from debt, right? Half of the money that you raised. The debt to equity ratio will become much more, we'll see much more dramatic in the sense that with the same example that I explained previously, my total debt is 10, my equity is 10. What does the debt to equity ratio show? It's 100% leverage. 100% looks much worse, right, than the 50%. The 50% is quite, intuitive. The 100% looks like it's much more. It's the same level of debt, it's just that it's expressed in a different way. But you have to be familiar with both types. Then we go on to coverage ratios, which are related to leverage, but in a different way. People argue that you only worry about how much leverage you've got when you actually go bankrupt, because then you have to distribute the assets, the splitting of the assets among your lenders and equity holders. But what really matters is how well you're able to comply with the payments and the responsibilities that come with having debt. Those payments and responsibilities are usually interest payments. So coverage ratios actually try to measure how well you can pay the payments that you have to make periodically, right? So in this case, your interest payments. So the EBIT interest coverage ratio, it's expressed in times, and generally we want this ratio to be as high as possible, right? Because that means that you are capable through your operations of paying your debt, right? Your debt payments. So EBIT, okay, earnings before interest and taxes, is used. Notice that we're not using net income because net income has been adjusted for, let's say, interest payments and so on, and it kind of muddies the water because you're mixing how well how well you're able to generate earnings through your operations with the financing decisions, right? Because by the time you calculate net income, you have already subtracted things like interest payments. So the financing decision is affecting how you're measuring how well you are generating earnings. While EBIT, earnings before interest and taxes, it's a much better measure of your operating earnings because it's not affected by interest payments. So EBIT is the measure that we're going to use as how well you're able to generate operating earnings, and interest payments are, the payments that you have to make because you have borrowed a certain amount of funding. So what if you have an EBIT of 100 and interest payments of 10, right? What does that mean? Remember, it's times, right? 10 times. It means that for every dollar of interest payment, and I would always suggest that you use the denominator as a reference, right? So for every dollar of interest payments, what does that 10 times mean? That you have 10 times the number of dollars, right? 10 times that amount in form of earnings. Can you pay? And the answer is, it looks like you can. Are you doing well? That is not as easy to say because remember, in order to assess whether you're doing well, you have to be able to compare your number to that of other companies. 10 times may seem fine, but what if your other competitors have coverage ratios of 30 times or 20 times? Then you begin to worry about, why is it that in your company you're not in such good shape, right? So remember, these you can explain what they mean, but in order to assess whether that means that you're doing well or not, it's always better to be able to either compare it to other companies in the same industry or compare it to yourself, right? Compare 2 years, different years, and you can assess whether the ratio has changed in the right direction. Some people like to use EBITDA as the interest coverage metric in the numerator, and the reason is that many times, especially with companies that have to buy a large number of fixed assets, the depreciation expenses can be very high, and so the argument goes that earnings look too small, but that's because of the depreciation expense, right? So the argument here is that if you add back depreciation and amortization, then it's a more fair calculation, right? Either way, these are two ways of estimating the interest coverage, okay? Either with EBIT or EBITDA. The traditional one that you will see is usually the one on top, but there are certain conditions under which you can use the one on the bottom. I just wanted to make you aware that that was the case. Liquidity ratios try to measure how well you are able to comply with your current obligations, and this is why you see that we divide current assets by current liabilities, right? So remember the current ratio, right, because it measures liquidity, how well you can cover your current obligations. We want it to be usually as high as possible, and it's usually measured in times, right? So if your current assets equal to $200 and your current liabilities are, let's say, 50, what does that mean, right? $50. What does that mean? That this ratio is 4 times. For every dollar of current liabilities that you have current assets that are worth 4 times that much. So can you pay? Can you comply with your current liabilities? The answer is it seems that way because you have 4 times the amount for that payment. Okay. Current liabilities, remember, are any liabilities that is due in 12 months or less. Usually, that's the definition of that. Are we doing well with the 4 times? And the answer should be we don't know unless we compare that to how well we have evolved in the past or to other competitors. Some people argue that having a current ratio that includes current assets there, it's not really very useful because in those current assets, what are your current assets here, right? So you will have things such as cash, right? You will have accounts receivable, you will have inventory, okay? And we are really assuming that all of these can be converted to cash relatively easily, right? Current, 12 months or less, right? The argument goes that, well, inventory, for example, right? Inventory items may not be easily converted to cash. So is that really part of the amount of assets that you have that you can liquidate and pay your current liabilities if you had to? So the argument is, yeah, probably inventory is not the case. So let's subtract inventories from current assets, and whatever is left, that is what we use as a measure of how well we can cover our current liabilities. In the end, the solution is sometimes as extreme as the initial problem, right? Because when you subtract inventory, what you're saying is that you cannot sell any of your inventory if you had to in order to pay your current liabilities. And we all know that that's not necessarily the case. You may be able to sell it, though, of course, you may have to sell it at a discounted price if you're in a hurry to do so. But, removing inventory completely is not necessarily realistic either. But those are liquidity ratios, right? How liquid is a company? It just basically tries to measure how well it can cover its current obligations.